everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you all keeping well. Apologies if things look a little bit different. When I was setting up, I somehow managed to snap the arm of my filming tripod. Don't ask me how, because I have no idea how I did it, but I managed to do it. So I'm just having to do a little bit of a makeshift setup until I can order a new one. Anyway, so that is that. Also, it's Easter weekend, so happy Easter to everyone, all of those who celebrate it for what it is, or whether it's just a good excuse to eat loads of chocolate. Just enjoy. Anyway, so as I said in the previous video, things are having to be fortnightly at the moment, just because things are a bit hectic and all up in the air. So that's the only time I can do things is fortnightly. And I will be completely honest, it was a bit of a squeeze to get this video in this week, but I'm determined to do it. So that's why I'm here. And today's video, we are on Richard the Lionheart part 2. I have done part 1. I will link that somewhere for you to go and find. And I feel I have spent so much time with Richard, he's starting to annoy me. In the nicest way possible. Anyway, so let's get on with today's video. Richard was now 31 years old, and he had been at war since he was 15. He was now King of England. And one of the first acts was to reward all of the old King Henry II's men who had stayed with him in his defeat and death. And that included William Marshal. And Marshal, who was sent to England from France to inform Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, of her husband's death. Marshal, he had remained loyal to the old king right up until the very end, and Richard, he needed men like Marshal. Henry II had rewarded Marshal, and Richard honoured that reward. A marriage to a young girl named Isabel de Clare, who was the daughter of a powerful lord named Strongbow. And Strongbow had lands in England, Wales and Ireland, and he had died several years before. So Isabel was the heiress to all of those lands. William Marshal, he had earned himself a reputation as a fearless knight, and now through the marriage to the 15-year-old heiress, he would become the Earl of Pembroke, becoming a very powerful lord. William Marshal remained true to his word, and he remained loyal to Richard until for the rest of his life. Richard's next agenda was to have his mother freed from house arrest and had Eleanor in charge of things in England until he arrived. Therefore, Eleanor was queen in name and practice. Richard also needed to sort out his brothers. His elder brothers, Henry the young king and Geoffrey, had both died, this leaving his youngest brother John and a few of Henry II's illegitimate children, especially Geoffrey, who was born in around 1151 and whose mother was one of many Henry's mistresses. Henry's many mistresses. Yeah, that makes more sense. So Geoffrey had been given a church upbringing, but he was never made a priest. Richard, he saw Geoffrey as a potential troublemaker, even a threat to the throne. Geoffrey was forced to take the priesthood almost immediately, and Richard made Geoffrey the Archbishop of York. Geoffrey, in Richard's eyes, he was sorted. Now for John. John was only in his early 20s, but he had already proven that he was a very slippery, devious and untrustworthy character. So Richard and Eleanor came up with a plan to stop John from basically making a nuisance of himself by giving him a lot of lands and wealth in the hope it'll keep him occupied, and also to lose the nickname given to him by his father of Lacklands. In late August 1189, John was married to a young rich heiress, Isabel, Countess of Gloucester, granddaughter to Robert of Gloucester. Richard, he was desperate to go on crusade, but that wasn't cheap. And Richard is well known for not spending much time in England. He only spent 6 months out of his 10-year reign, and he was accused of robbing England blind, and jokingly said if he could find the right buyer, he would sell London to go on crusade. And Richard only saw England as a big money pot. Richard, he did raise the taxes, but he also sold what he had to willing buyers, which was something all kings did. When a position like the county sheriff became available, the lords of the realm would pay their king for the honour, and the appointed sheriff was the king's representative within that county, being responsible for law and order and to carry out their will. The cost of going on crusade was a substantial amount of money, at least £100,000. And back in the 12th century, the king's yearly income was half that. In today's money, that's over £1 trillion. That's insane. 3 years previously, Richard and King Philip of France agreed to go on crusade, and they'd been friends for most of their adult lives. But now there's tension. Going on crusade was an incredibly dangerous and very likely way to get yourself killed in either battle or from disease or just simply bad luck. Only weeks before Richard and Philip were about to set sail, the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, on his journey east, drowned in a river. Richard, he had squeezed money out of everything he could. He'd made himself the richest king in England ever. And Richard had enough money to pay for a fleet of ships and set sail for the Holy Land. But not all would go plain sailing. Richard and Philip's army reached the city of Lyon, but when they get there, there is a disaster. A bridge over the river Rhône. I really apologise for that. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So many people piled over the bridge collapses, and hundreds were suddenly plunged into the water, and several drowned. Not the best start. Richard and Philip decide to split their forces. The French will go to Chenier. Again, I apologise. I am rubbish at pronunciations and I'm really, really sorry. And Richard would hire ships to take them to the Holy Land. So Richard will take his men to Marseille, where his fleet of ships full of more English crusaders will meet him there, and they'll meet up again in Sicily. Philip's plan goes just as it should. Richard, not quite. When Richard gets to Marseille, his fleet is nowhere to be seen. The sailors had decided to take their sweet little time, and they'd made their way from the south coast of England to the Mediterranean, and they stopped off at Lisbon and then Portugal. And now they've gone just a little bit crazy. When the sailors docked, they rushed into the city and caused absolute havoc. First, they got blind drunk, and then they plundered the houses of all the Jews and Muslims they could find. They raped, burned, stole, and looted until the King of Portugal had to lock the city gates and throw several hundred crusaders in jail. Eventually, the English captains got their men back under control, but by then the damage was done. What did Richard think, you may ask? He weren't really bothered. It didn't faze him. He had a plan, and he kept to that plan. His plan was to meet Philip in Sicily, and he'd just simply have to find another way. That other way was transporter ships. So Sicily in the Middle Ages was a vital, rich, and highly unstable point in the middle of the Mediterranean. It had been ruled by Romans, Greeks, Arabs, and in Richard's time, Christian kings from the same family as William the Conqueror. Sicily was also crusader country. Philip, he's already there waiting for Richard, but once Richard arrives, he has a little bit of family business to sort out. Richard's little sister, Joan or Joanna, was sent to marry the King of Sicily, William II, when she was 12 years old in 1177. In 1189, William II died, and he was succeeded by his cousin called Tancred, who was a very unpleasant man who was given the nickname the Monkey King simply because he was covered in hair. Tancred hadn't been treating Joan very nicely, and he'd put her under house arrest and taken control of all of her money, and now Joan's big brother has just landed on the island with a massive army, and he's just been informed of what Tancred has been doing to his little sister. As you can imagine, Richard was none too happy. And Richard, he's in a mood for a fight. He'd already got into an argument on his way with some peasants in southern Italy. Richard accused them of flying birds of prey, a practice that Richard believed was for noble men only. And he whacked the peasant so hard with the flat of his sword, the blade snapped. But Richard had to make a bit of a quick getaway as he was chased down by the peasants. Richard and his army arrived in Messina, I hope that's right, on the 22nd of September 1190. Richard's men, also itching for a fight, they tear Messina into bits in one afternoon. Within a couple of days, Tancred, he agreed to hand over Joan along with all of her money. Job done. But now with having both Richard and Philip's fleets in Messina, the cost of food and lack of it and the supplies made both sides desperate. Richard took over a monastery and used it as a supply dump, and rumours were quickly spreading that Richard had intended to conquer the city or even the whole island, and fighting had begun to break out among the two armies. And the local authorities, unable to stop it, Richard had invited King Philip and the governors of Messina to a conference at his lodgings to come up with a solution of the ever-growing disorder. Now, while they were discussing, they were interrupted by sounds of shouting, and a clash of arms had breached them from outside. a riot at the lodgings of an ally of Richard was under attack. Time for talking was over. King Philip, he wouldn't help. So Richard, he took up his sword, marched out of the conference calling for his men. Together they broke down the gates of Messina and charged into the riot. Richard at the front. Anyone who resisted was killed in the massacre. Richard had lost 25 men, but within a couple of hours, it was all over. The English soldiers plundered the conquered city and raised the banners of their king. Now, King Philip, he demanded that they be taken down and his be put in their place as an equal partner in the crusade. Philip, he expected an equal share in the loot, and in an effort to compromise, Richard had his banners taken down and had the banners of the Templars and the Hospitallers raised in their place, and Richard handed the control of the city to them. Richard had now finally told Philip that he won't be marrying his sister Alice, who Richard had been betrothed to for over 20 years. Richard offers Philip a cash settlement out of his vow to marry Alice. Philip, he reluctantly agrees, but really Philip had had enough of Richard and his flash, forceful tactics, and also making Philip look like the lesser king. And Richard, he'd also fallen out with one of Philip's favourite knights. When they were out for a ride in the country, they'd come across a peasant who was carrying a bundle of sticks. The men, they grabbed those sticks and they organised a mock tournament and were messing around, bashing each other, pretend fighting with the sticks, except Richard, not really capable of having a pretend fight, gets into it with Philip's favourite knight, who was a man named William de Bear. Their play fighting turned nasty. Richard started screaming at William, calling him every name under the sun and banning him from the crusade. Richard only backs down when all of the French knights and Philip agree to grovel on their knees and apologise to him. Richard was a lot more like his father than he'd like to think. Philip had one last dig at Richard. Richard's mother, Eleanor, is arriving with his new bride, Berengaria of Navarre. And Philip, he tries to block Eleanor and Berengaria's passage onto the mainland by asking Tancred to stop them from landing on Sicily. But Tancred refuses. He'd already had his ass kicked by Richard, and he'd also been given the gift of the legendary sword of Excalibur, supposedly. So Philip leaves in a huff, planning to reach the Holy Land before Richard. Eleanor, she finally got to spend time with her favourite son Richard and her daughter, who she hadn't seen since she was 12 years old. But unfortunately, Eleanor couldn't stay for very long. She needed to get back home, as she had heard that John was stirring up some trouble. So Richard and Berengaria were unable to marry straight away, as it was Lent, so they set sail on the 10th of April 1191, over 200 ships, carrying over 17,000 people, along with siege engines, horses, supplies and treasure. Berengaria and Joan was on one of the biggest ships. They were only 3 days at sea when a massive storm hit, scattering the fleet. Joan and Berengaria being blown to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus had once been part of the Byzantine Empire, and a member of the royal family had seized it for himself, set himself up as an independent ruler, calling himself emperor. Isaac the Tyrant. Now, he'd allied himself with Saladin, and all of those from Richard's ships who'd washed up on shore was arrested and thrown into prison, being treated horribly. Isaac had tried to force Berengaria and Joan off their ship. Now, Richard, he arrived at Limassol, again, I hope that's right, finding his bride-to-be and little sister in danger. Now, Isaac, he refused to release the prisoners or give Richard his property back. So Isaac, now realising a little too late that he'd picked on the wrong people, Richard attacked the defending army. Isaac's forces didn't stand a chance against Richard's. Now, Richard, he conquered Cyprus in 10 days. Isaac agreed to give himself up in one condition, that he didn't want to be clapped in irons. Richard, being a reasonable man, agreed to that condition. So Richard had Isaac placed in custom-made silver chains instead. Richard had Cyprus, but he had no intentions in keeping it for himself. He announces a heavy property tax, orders all of the native men to shave off their beards, simply because he could, and he then sells Cyprus to the Knights Templar. Richard and Berengaria are now free to marry, and they married on the 22nd of May 1191. Berengaria being the only Queen of England who never stepped foot on England. Richard, he set sail for Acre, located on the coast of modern Israel, the most important merchant city in Jerusalem. Saladin's men held it after taking the city a few years previously, but the crusaders have it surrounded, and the most senior leader there, King Philip Augustus. When Richard arrived in Tyre in Lebanon, Philip wouldn't let him into the city. Richard, not overly fussed. But Richard's battle for the Holy Land was just about to begin. And that is where I'm going to end it. I am going to stretch this bugger out, sorry. So you just have to make sure you like and you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss part 3. We're going to spend a little bit more time with Richard, and then we'll finally move on from him and go on to someone else. But there you go. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for just being you, because you're all wonderful. So thank you so much. Enjoy whatever you're doing for the Easter holidays, whether you're going to be like me, working it, or whether you're planning Easter egg hunts, or you're going to church to celebrate. You do whatever you are doing, and just keep being wonderful. But anyway, I'll see you all next time. Take care. Bye. Mwah.